So let's start with a few moments with the eyes closed. Closing the eyes, taking some deeper breaths. Centering ourselves in the middle of the chest. Letting the breath pass in and out of the heart space. And feeling a sensation of depth and intimacy in the heart space. A student asked Nisargadatta Maharaj, "What is the ultimate truth?" And he said, "You." So the second yama is called Satyam, and Satyam means truthfulness, and of course it implies non-lying. And it has its root in the Sanskrit word sat, S-A-T. And sat is a word which means existence, pure existence. So sat means what is, or the reality. And it's a very holy word in India, so there's a very holy saying, Om Tat Sat, and we'll see that a little bit later on in the topic. Maybe you've heard of the other saying, Sat Chit Ananda, as one of the names of God. So Sat, pure existence, Chit, pure consciousness, and Ananda, pure bliss. So the nature of God, or the nature of the reality, is existence, consciousness, awareness, and bliss. And the reason that Satyam is meaning truthfulness is because it's a way of speaking truth, and truthfulness is the existence, or it's this one of the names of God, and we'll have a look at how this connects. In many traditions, there's a emphasis given to the significance of speech. So in many traditions, speech is said to have a magical power. So for example, with prayer, with magic, and with spells, the magic is conducted through speech or through words. Spells are being cast. So are blessings given through speech. In the Buddhist traditions, they speak about the precepts between the body, the speech, and the mind. So speech being another way that we act in this world. So we perform actions through our body. By hugging someone or hitting them, we're acting with the body. With the mind, through thoughts. And also with the speech is a way of manifesting in the world, actually. In the Zoroastrian tradition, they speak about good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, which is the same as the Buddhists. And many traditions also speak about sound, or the word being the first vibration of our reality. So in the Bible, first there was the word, and the word was God. And in the Hindu tradition, they speak about Aum or Om being the first sound, or the first word. And of course we can just contemplate that words are vibrations, we might think, well, the power is coming from the thoughts or the meaning behind it, but actually the words, of course, are conveying that vibration and manifesting a type of vibration out into the world. And it's a way of acting and affecting and creating in this existence and the reality. Also in the Bible, we're advised not to bear false witness, as in to lie against the neighbor, or to it's looked at as being significant and something that we want to watch out for. Also in India, we speak a lot about mantra, so there's this magical capacity for the way that the sounds come together in a mantra. As I said, also with the words, with prayers, with speech, and in magic. So the message of Satyam, there are many messages in Satyam, but the main message is to revere and to respect and to honor the power of the words that we use. And one other thing that's interesting is to also avoid trivial speech, which is not really honoring the power of the speech and wasting our own energy, and also, of course, wasting the energy of others. Especially speech that is unnecessary or damaging because of the resonance that it carries. Jesus in the Gospel of John says, "You will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." And Gandhi said, "Truth is God, and God is truth." We can see what Patanjali says when this is perfected. He says, when grounded in truthfulness, Satya, action and its fruition depend on his will. So meaning something like whatever the yogi says exists. So the yogi has the power to manifest anything in the universe based on his speech. And it makes sense because when we've perfected truthfulness, so our words only represent Sat, or when we speak and it only represents the truth, our speech is so perfectly aligned with the reality as it is, it's so true, then it's almost like the chicken or the egg. Which one came first? That the yogi spoke and it was, or it was and he spoke of it? So there's just such an alignment, and there's a power that comes from being so aligned with existence, with that power of being truthful. So the yogi would not speak, think, or will something that's not true. And actually in yoga, this is called, it's a paranormal capacity, and it's called Vak Siddhi. So the siddhis in yoga are the paranormal powers, and Vak means speech. So it's the capacity to predict or manifest effects just through speaking or thinking of them. So the conclusion of this could be, don't cry wolf. So don't speak in a superfluous way. Actually use your speech with an understanding of its power and respecting its power. In the Mahamudra tradition, there's this beautiful saying, settle your speech naturally in silence, like a lute with its strings cut. Settle your speech naturally in silence, like a lute with its strings cut. We can also consider the difference between relative and absolute truth. This is a very important distinction in our spiritual understanding, the difference between the relative and the absolute. So just considering the simple definitions of these words, relative is this subjective, changing, personal world, my perspective, your perspective, and the truths associated with it. And the absolute truth is the existence itself. So Sat, this pure reality, which is not really meant to be an abstract spiritual enlightenment philosophy, but just stepping back from that mind perspective of what you are seeing in front of you right now. So being totally present to everything as it is, without a filter of the mind between you and the reality, just being present. is the absolute truth. So the relative truth is the individual perspective and on the level of the individual and their mind. It's in the realm of the relative, where everything is subject to the law of dependent arising and impermanence, which are Buddhist concepts. That everything is subject to the law of dependent arising means that nothing exists in and of itself. Everything is contingent on something before it and will lead to something after it. Everything is subject to karma and cause and effect. This is the relative world. Nothing has truth in and of itself. Its truth is known in relation to the knower and the ideas and its history and its form and its perception. And also the law of impermanence, that everything will fall away. So even the truth as we know it, depending on its other its history and all of the dependent arisingness of the wooden stick, it also is impermanent, so it will fall away. So the truth is also, even if we could find some truth in a moment, it's not the truth in the next moment, because eventually it will fall away and it's subject to time. So this is the relative truths. They're subject to change, they're personal. How do you feel today? If you ask me that, I would have to, how do I speak the truth and give you some kind of truth to that in such a relative world? Well, in terms of the relative, it's speaking the truth and conveying and offering the truth to the best that we know it. So that's the relative truth. We can also speak about the relativity of perception, that our perception is always going to be subject to flaws in our sense organs, our capacity to report correctly, and the filters and conditionings that we have when we're perceiving something. So this is all in the realm of the relative. So how can we practice truthfulness in this relative world where everything is subject to change and subject to reporting and errors and conditioning? Basically, like we said, by expressing that which we best know and feel is the truth, and also being in alignment with what we know. So best trying to build this inner compass with what we believe is true in the moment and having the courage to speak it. So Satya is not just a restriction of being dishonest, but it's an act of purification. And most beautifully, Satya is bringing a transparency of our being. So we'll get into in a moment the different reasons that we would lie and be dishonest. And of course, practicing Satya is not just about cutting away, holding your tongue and making sure you don't say a lie, but inviting us to more and more allow our entire being to be transparent, which is such a beautiful quality that actually leads to power and alignment and success in our lives. As we know, transparency is something that is important for us to develop. We get to, in this pursuit of transparency, we get to question, why are we being dishonest? Is it for personal gain? Is it for out of fear? Is it for a sense of control, which tend to be the main ones? So we get to question those habits or maybe those unconscious patterns that we have where we are continuously actually lying or being dishonest in the same ways. And what is the reason for them on a personal level? And truthfulness can lead to a deepening of our understanding of ourself and what it means for ourselves to be aligned with honesty, honor, and courage. And of course, it becomes a spiritual practice when we see that behind the changing opinions. So our opinions are always changing. In one moment our truth was this and our purpose was that. But we are invited to question who is behind the changing opinions. because a lot of times we identify ourselves with what we say and what we believe and what we take to be true and our opinions. But does that mean that we change? Who am I behind all the opinions? Is one of the greatest questionings that Satya can offer us. Like all the yamas and yamas, eventually Satya is inviting us to live from a state of naturalness, freedom from any fears, and just having this total purity and transparency of being, speaking the truth and not having the tensions and restrictions and the contractions that come from needing to protect and cover up and be dishonest. I'd like to offer a definition about that, what the word absolute means when we start to look at absolute truth. So absolute simply means not qualified or diminished in any way, total. So absolute silence or absolute secrecy means that it's like a complete and total and of powers or rights, not subject to any limitation, it's unconditional. So that's the dictionary condition there. And when we're speaking about spirituality and truth and existence, the absolute just means this totality. So the absolute is the opposite of relative. Relative is diminished, distinguished, and cut up into pieces relative to each other. Absolute is the wholeness, no distinction. What is the absolute nature of reality? We know the relative. Everything is relative in space and time, form, universe, manifestation, energy. That's the relative. The absolute is this background of stillness, the oneness, the part of ourself that is life itself, aliveness without any form or distinction. And of course we can speak about truth on both levels, on the relative and on the absolute level. So on the absolute level, truth is Sat, so existence, truth, God, this background of oneness. Complete. Lao Tzu from the Taoist tradition says, the Tao that can be named is not the absolute Tao. So the Tao that can be named, it can be named and captured with a label and with a form, which is a thought. So if a thought can be put onto the Tao, it's not the Tao. So the Tao in Taoism means the way, or the absolute, or this pure existence itself. So not my existence or that existence or this reality, but the entire reality, the absolute. The Tao that can be named is not the absolute Tao. And Shankaracharya says, out of desire for liberation, you should root out all other desires, renounce activity, and take to a perpetual preoccupation with truth, which will lead on to perpetual meditation. Then alone the waves of the mind can be stilled. And this is such a beautiful idea that instead of trying to still the waves of the mind, so focusing on the breath or doing concentration practices, concentrating in order to still the waves of the mind, actually this beautiful advice is to have this perpetual preoccupation with the truth. So by bringing our attention onto the truth, being so interested in the truth, the waves of the mind will be stilled. Because the truth is not a wave of the mind. The truth is stillness. So bringing our attention to stillness is not using the mind to get there, but actually surmounting the mind itself. And then there's this saying that we started with, Om Tat Sat, which is, definition is, existence is the absolute truth. So Om meaning holy, primordial, absolute. Tat, which is another word, the loose translation is that, meaning that which cannot be named, Tat, and Sat, existence. So existence is the absolute truth. Om Tat Sat. And another beautiful saying from India is Satyam Shivam Sundaram. The definition of this: Satyam, true; Shivam, good or auspicious; and Sundaram, beautiful. So Satyam, Shivam, Sundaram is one of the names for God, and God is true, God is good, and God is beautiful. Meaning the existence is true, good, and beautiful. Nisargadatta Maharaj. Whatever you understand is not the truth, and it is to be thrown overboard. You are trying to catch hold of something and cling to it. Accept as it is what I am telling you. Don't be carried away by concepts. Don't employ any words, and look at yourself as you are. Few people understand what I'm driving at. So this is, of course, referring to the absolute truth. Look at yourself as you are. Don't employ words. So no labeling, and no, once again, using the waves of the mind that go outward, out of stillness, to try to understand stillness. Actually, resting back into our own being is the quickest and the most true way to connect to that truth of our being. Which is more important, Satyam or Ahimsa? A beautiful answer by Gandhi. He says, my religion is based on truth and non-violence. So Satyam and Ahimsa. Truth is my God. Non-violence is the means of realizing Him. So these two principles are inseparable, and actually we need to form a coherence between them. They're pointing at the same thing. Truth is the reality, and non-violence is the way of connecting to this reality, of opening to the natural state. It's not always so easy, and if we need to take a priority, really Ahimsa comes first. Ahimsa takes priority. It's not like, oh, the truth is that I don't like the way that person looks, and I need to tell them that's the truth. Actually, Ahimsa first is a good rule. So first, do no harm. Satya is the aspiration to express our highest perceived truth through our actions, speech, and thoughts. So it's an aspiration, a desire to lift ourselves up and have that courage to express our highest truth, even if it's relative, but definitely having this connection to the heart, which will bring more in this absolute nature. Why do we lie? So Jung says, a lie would make no sense unless the truth was felt to be dangerous. The opposite of truthfulness and non-harm and non-stealing are rooted in the ego, which believes itself to be a separate identity. And the ego is this body-mind construct which believes itself to be limited and therefore threatened and therefore needing to survive. And then the actions naturally spring forth from that, where we would need to lie because we believe we're protecting ourselves, lying for personal gain. And when we practice Satyam, it's a way of affirming the universal nature of ourself, which of course it cannot be threatened, has no reason to lie, has no interest in personal gain, because it understands the entire reality being belonging to the truth. So the Hridaya Yoga perspective is that any truth spoken from the heart will open others to love and unity, because it brings an intuition of our true nature. So abiding in Satya purifies the mind and brings more simplicity. And this is something that I can verify myself, that there's a lot of times on this journey and on this path of believing the sages. So I believe the sages. I know I want to practice more truthfulness. Rationally, it makes sense. Scientifically, it makes sense to me. And I practice truthfulness. And it's hard because the way that I've been conditioned in my life and from the society is that, there is a lack. There's a lack of resources, and there's a lack of emotional resources and mental resources around, and we better fight, and you need to push, and you don't want to be left behind. So that's the conditioning that as a human being I've grown up with. And I don't believe that anymore because I so consciously believe in this new truthfulness. So when I want to act in alignment with truth and I want to speak what I believe to be true and share it, it's taken a lot of courage and it's taken strength, and sometimes it's been really difficult. But I can verify that any truth spoken from the heart will open others to love and unity because it brings an intuition of our real nature. So I can verify, and maybe you can as well, that when you've spoken the truth, whether it took a lot of courage or it was easy to do it, hopefully it's getting easier, it's also opened others. So it didn't have the reaction that we were so fearful of, that we just necessarily, by default, take these actions of dishonesty because we believe that the repercussions of truthfulness will be really scary and fearful. It's not that way usually. So some words about authenticity. It's a word that's coming up a lot about being more authentic and living from this place of transparency. So I like the word authenticity, especially because it's referred to a lot in our kind of more spiritual societies. People are valuing authenticity, and the deeper we go into authenticity, we see that it's really about having a transparency of our being, not needing to hide behind masks and not complying with ahimsa. And it's not really coming from the transparency of our being and from being rooted in the spiritual heart. Actually, the authenticity is coming from suppressed or repressed personal attributes that haven't been expressed. So it's not really the truth of your being that's being expressed, but it's something that's being held back in that needed to be shared. So there might be a little bit of a distinction here. Ultimately, the truth is meant to purify us, not meant to exacerbate or amplify aggressive tendencies in our being or other tendencies. When we open to authenticity, we get to see more and more how potent the truth is, because we see that that authentic speech starts to create and manifest in the world in a very special way. And it definitely is worth saying again about meaningless words and small talk, pleasantries, trivial speech, gossip, which might not actually seem like they have to do with authenticity, but talk like this, trivial speech, are cluttering the mind and feeding the ego. So the yamas and niyamas are preparing us, or are the foundation for our yoga and meditation practice. So we can't just join a meditation course and expect, just jump in at number 7 in Ashtanga, jump in at level 7 meditation and expect to get anywhere if our mind is so noisy and cluttered from the small talk and the speech and just the diffusing and the diminishing of that potent energy of our being to create and manifest. Authenticity is a way of allowing everything to be as it is. So authenticity is really this expression of our natural state, of being grounded in the question, who am I? And being open. So that's why authenticity isn't just, as some of this neo-spirituality refers to authenticity as being fully expressed and, letting your shadows out all over the place. That's not really the transparency and authenticity that we're speaking about. Authenticity is this purifying force of having the courage and the interest in stilling ourselves back into ourselves, into stillness, and then expressing or not expressing from that space. Truth is a freedom. So this is an interesting concept where, especially about the relative truth, so speaking truth and not lying affords us a freedom because we don't need to fear and worry about what other people think about us. And if we have said something else and now we're saying something different, where did I tell that person I was going yesterday, and trying to cover up, and then this process of digging a hole by not speaking the truth. So the more and more we can commit to truth and speaking the truth, even on a relative level, there's a freedom and a relaxation. So remember that freedom, truth, and naturalness are one. There's an old Vedantic statement which says, "It is the truth that reveals the truth." So this is the absolute understanding, that the truth of our being reveals the truth of our being. And that no thought will ever be able to capture what you are. Only your own awareness is large enough, infinite enough, to know your infinite self. So no thought will ever be able to capture what you are. Only your own awareness is large enough, infinite enough, to know your infinite self. And a Hridaya Yoga perspective, when we face the truth beyond fears and attachments, in the purity of our being, we allow ourselves to be illuminated by the truth. In this way, we become courageous. Also, from a Hridaya perspective, there's this concept of purity of intention, which is really beautiful. So purity of intention is the transparency of our being, again. And the transparency of our being, remember, is that not having those filters and fears and judgments and attachments layered on top of this beingness and the truth of this moment. So pretty much the purity of intention can be defined as acting from a place of love instead of from a place of fear and personal desire. So acting from a place of any personal desire, even if it's a positive one, is not really the purity of intention. So a personal desire that is really great, I want this to be a success, or I want this to benefit myself, or I want this to benefit my family, is not the purity of intention, because it still has a personal desire attached to it. It's still a personal willing, based on our own conditions, willing the circumstances in a particular direction that's narrow, instead of opening up to the infinite possibilities of life. So some words about sincerity. That in the face of truth, it's not really possible to manipulate circumstances or try to control circumstances or control speech. So we can speak a little bit about spiritual states as well. There's a quote from Gandhi. "Often in my progress, I've had a faint glimpse of the absolute truth God. And daily, the conviction is growing upon me that He alone is real and all else is unreal." So, there's a lot of studies about peak experiences and spiritual states, and different states of awakening of consciousness and different states of meditation. And the common thread that comes back from these kind of scientific reports about people who've had peak experiences and spiritual states is that those states of awareness and presence feel more real than the normal waking state. Whereas when we have a dream, it feels more real when we wake up from the dream. So when we were in the dream, it felt real, and it felt like everything that was happening in the dream was alive and relevant. Unless we were lucid dreaming, we thought that was the truth. But later when we wake up, it feels as if that dream is less true and that this waking reality is more true. Well, the same thing happens when people report having a spiritual experience. They felt there was something true there and something was real there, that they were waking up from the normal waking state actually. And this is reflected in Gandhi's quote, and he says, "The conviction is growing upon me that he alone is real and all else is unreal." So the more that we do the meditation practice and the more that we touch the spiritual heart and send our awareness into this feeling of pure being, pure existence, we're more and more getting this feeling that something here is true, and the more we investigate it, we say this is actually more real. It becomes much, much more obvious that the thoughts are moving and falling away, and the thoughts are changing. The body is actually just felt as sensations and perceptions through my sight, but there's something more real that we start to approach in the spiritual practice. And this brings us to one of my favorite words that Patanjali uses in the Yoga Sutras, Ritambhara. And he says in chapter 1, Sutra 48, "In this state of samadhi, insight in itself is truth-bearing." And that's what the word Ritambhara means. And maybe you've felt in your own meditation or spiritual practice when you've touched into something, or there was an insight, or there was a knowing, or there was a shifting, and you didn't need to affirm its truth or its significance based on something that you knew through the mind. That this insight or this touching and this knowing of the heart was truth-bearing. Ritambhara means that it was true in and of itself. It radiated truth. Truth wasn't something that was ascribed to it. So definitely in my own meditation practice, just that knowing of that word that Patanjali had used 2,000 years ago rung something inside of me that said, yes, I know what that feeling is, to have truth shining from the inside out. One of my favorite quotes from Swami Vivekananda, he says, "Truth stands on its own evidence. It does not require any other testimony to prove it's true. It is self-effulgent. It penetrates into the innermost corners of our nature, and in its presence the whole universe stands up and says, 'This is truth.'" Some words about dishonesty. Dishonesty is putting up masks or false images of our ego, lying or deceiving, misleading or half-truths, or hurting others. The difficulties here is that when we lie to others, we also lie to ourselves. So when we lie to others, we don't have the self-awareness, which is so important for our spiritual practice. So lying to others is this falling into a conditioning and falling out of the awareness and presence of life. And like I said, that appropriate self-awareness is so important for the spiritual practice. If we live in a fantasy, how can we move towards the reality? Or that another word for that fantasy is if we're living in this matrix of conditioning, where we're like robots, just unfolding the motions without this self-reflection. If we're living in that fantasy matrix, how can we move towards the reality? And if we're applying to dishonesty, how can we learn to respect the truth above that temporary pleasure and gain that the ego is seeking, always a temporary pleasure and gain? And if we're not seeking out truth and we're being dishonest, we're not actually learning to aim ourselves and orient towards truth and respect the truth. So we can start practicing truthfulness by, of course, speaking truth and starting with ourselves. Gandhi says, to believe in something and not to live it is dishonest. We can start to build this truthfulness inside of our being by being honest with ourselves and being in alignment with that transparency and authenticity. Satyam increases honesty, sincerity, courage, integrity, trust, awareness, acceptance of others, kindness, love, compassion, fairness, openness, perceptiveness, reliability, tactfulness, tolerance, and understanding. So courage will be one of the main tools for transforming our society and the sickness of the world. Vivekananda says, truth does not pay homage to any society, ancient or modern. Society has to pay homage to truth or die. We can look at the values of Spanda school. So maybe you've seen that there are these 5 values. You can have a look at them on the website under the school. And the values are allowing and flow, synchronicity and abundance, trust and gratitude, awareness and direct knowledge, or Shiva consciousness. And the last one is radical self-honesty. So this one is described, radical self-honesty, as our most painful unraveling, but also our greatest tool for joy, relief, and peace, is the capacity to look inside ourselves. We can honestly see what our beliefs are and how they shape our reality. We aren't born with this capacity fully expressed. Rather, it is something we slowly learn on our path of being an exceptional human being, totally committed to completion, beauty, growth, and the gift of our life. So Satyam decreases fear, hatred, judgments, unfounded justification, shame, guilt, greediness, and selfishness. How can we practice Satya? Listen to the thoughts that you whisper to yourself. Investigate the judgments that you hold and question their truthfulness. Avoid pretending to be someone that you're not. So this also goes to the way that we might hide different parts of ourselves, maybe where we work or what we did that morning or different parts about what we believe. So avoiding putting on these masks. Practicing connecting with the spiritual heart and listening to the true calling of our hearts in each moment. Avoid just being nice as social behavior and, of course, small talk and useless talk. Strive to seek further and further the true foundation of knowledge and the true nature of truth. So starting to seek more at the absolute truth will penetrate into our relative truth capacities. And practice trusting yourself. Then we can start to notice how our nature changes in the interaction with others when we start to practice more truthfulness. Be aware of how your words are filled with power. Learn how to develop the skills to be honest, still respecting and considering other people's feelings and vulnerabilities, which is this topic about boundaries that we speak about often. So having that honesty and being totally transparent to what your self needs to express, but still respecting and considering other people's feelings and their vulnerabilities. And if you don't know how to say something skillfully, then in many cases it would be better to just not say it yet to someone else. And that quote from Mark Twain, if you tell the truth, you don't have to remember anything. Shivananda says, a truthful man is absolutely free from worries and anxieties. He has a calm mind and he is respected by all. And Thomas Keating, silence is the language God speaks, and everything else is a bad translation. So of course, it's not that everything else is a bad translation, but there's a power in silence, and resting in silence like a lute with its strings cut. So a moment with the eyes closed. Resting back into the silence of our being.